We will now continue with the question and answer session. Is there a question from Mexico? All right. We'll continue with the facts question. As a matter of fact, well, okay, we're actually going to Aguascalientes, Mexico. Go ahead, please.
You could hold on a second to see if we can work this out. Adelante, México, su pregunta.
Okay, I think we're having a technical difficulty, so we're going to go with our question that was faxed in from Cuba, as a matter of fact. And this is a question about, is home-based work gradually erasing or the traditional dividing line between work and family? And we'll have, or do we have to redefine our concept of family, since our traditional concept of work has already been changed?
Oh, yes. This is very important, particularly in my country, where employers have been encouraging employees to work from home. And one of the disadvantages of working from home is that your family don't expect you to be working. They see so little of you that when you do get home, they expect you to be there for them. So it is quite difficult to work from home for many people. Homes weren't designed for that. The study often doesn't have a door on it, or it's in the main traffic part of the house. So that is a dilemma, with working from home. But the more interesting part of the question for me is about this redefinition of family. This is already happening. In my country, and I can speak with authority from it, there are three family groupings that are about equal nowadays. One of those is the traditional husband and wife and kids. Another one is single parents and kids. And the third group is people living alone. And they are the top three groups, and they're about equal. It's a huge change.
All right. I think we have the line open now with Mexico, so we go back to Mexico for our next question. Go ahead, please.
The tendencies and modern practices that you have set forth, of course, they're very beneficial. However, they do represent a threat for the unions in organizations that traditionally don't accept these ideas. What do you propose to try and defeat this resistance to change?
Thank you for raising the very important question of the role of trade unions. The world has seen a diminution in the power of trade unions consistently for the last 40 or 50 years. And much of this has come about because of the supposed enmity between business and unions. The theory was that the businessman was on one side and the unionist was on the other, and they were fighting continuously. And in that fight, the business owner has come out clearly on top. But this doesn't diminish the important role of organisation of labour, in organising labour. Neither, as we've seen in some really interesting examples in various parts of the world, has it diminished the role of trade unions, where they've seen themselves as being the supporter of the worker in the workplace rather than the combatant of management. And I think that the challenge for trade unions is to get over the idea that they're fighting the boss and get into the idea that they're supporting the worker. And there's still as much work that needs to be done to support the worker as there always has been. And if they can redefine themselves that way, they're still incredibly relevant.
All right, great. Thank you. Our next question comes from Ecuador. Go ahead, please.
I'm calling from the University of Espíritu Santo, and the question is, what can we do to diminish this personal resistance that we see in terms of this new world market in terms of work?
I mentioned in an early module today Ulrich Beck's notion of the Brazilianization of the world, and particularly of the West. and he talks about the two categories that are most threatened. And I think it is a fear of being in one of those two categories, either the working poor or those who are excluded from the workforce. It's that fear that drives much of the resistance. It's also being driven by older generations who thought they had a pretty clear idea of the way the world was supposed to work. It was supposed to work by having you go to work for a few hours and then provide for your family with the money you earned. That's changed so much. So I think the way to overcome that resistance is to recognise that there still is a tremendous amount that we need doing. We just need to organise ourselves differently to do it. And if we can achieve that, we'll overcome much of what is perceived as resistance currently.
Thank you. Next question is from Sinaloa, Mexico. Go ahead, please.
Sí, muy buenos días.
Good morning. We're calling from the Colegio de Bachilleres of the state of Sinaloa, here from Mexico. Right here present in the group, we have 125 workers from the different divisions. And our question is the following. We're really very interested in this video conference, and our question here is that, well, in our country, in Mexico, it's a reality in terms that workers have to have 2 or more activities because salaries are really much below of our expectations. So how can we really combine all these types of work, electronic work, agrarian work, industrial work? How can we combine these types of work in a friendly environment?
Thank you for such profound questions. It gives me a chance to say a little about the role of governments in all this. I suggested in my presentation that since so much work in countries like Mexico is still done domestically, that it makes sense to look at what works in a domestic environment. And the people who can do that best are the government. And that means that governments can set up the way in which they organise themselves in ways that work for the local people. And there are a variety of things they can do. Some countries have social safety nets that make sure that people who are excluded from the workforce are still protected in some way. Other people have minimum wage legislation that tries to provide a working wage for people. I think it is very difficult for individual people and individual organisations to make these things work unless the whole of the country is starting to think that way. But in those countries where we've seen some of these things happen, they have seen a change slowly in excluding those people who would be traditionally excluded from the workforce.
Thank you. And we go to Veracruz, Mexico for our next question. Go ahead, please.
Superior of Veracruz. And my question is the following. What are the economic and productive risks for developing countries that don't have enough technology in terms of starting this new step in globalization? What are the risks?
Well, another interesting question. In this modern global world, it is access to technology that is mandatory if you're going to compete, if you're even going to be recognised and seen. So I guess the most profound risk is that you're simply left out. You simply get excluded. But the reality is that modern technology is not only increasingly cheap, but it is increasingly ubiquitous. It's available everywhere. Technology is not a very good respecter of national boundaries. It's quite possible to access technology from all parts of the world, whether or not it's actually sanctioned by the local government or whomever. So really there are no excuses nowadays for people being excluded from technological access, because there are so many ways, as this program demonstrates, of getting access to the technology.
The thing is cheap, but the expenses in training.
Yes, that's right.
Our next question comes from Lima, Peru. Go ahead, please.
I'm calling from Lima, from the University Ricardo Palma. My question is the following. Culture and local values are very important elements for education and educating our young in a very competitive environment. How can we combine those elements with a world that demands harsh requirements, and also to be able to develop young adults that can work and satisfy their own personal needs?
Boy, these are good questions. I think one of the biggest mistakes that countries around the world have made in recent years is to say we must be competitive at all costs. And what they've discovered is that if they say that and attempt to achieve it, they can appear competitive for a while. But then things change. Some other country comes on board that's prepared to do it cheaper or offer something else, and then you find yourself left out. So I think the answer to your question is to not forget the importance of the local culture, and that you really, this has to work for your people. This has to work for your young people, for your adults, and for your older people, who are going to increasingly depend on the work done by younger people. So if you get yourself sucked into a world of competitiveness and forget, you'll just be discarded.
So the question is how to balance the global versus the local.
Exactly. Very profound question and very difficult.
All right.